Hi, welcome back. This will be the third section of our video posts. Usually by the end of the first week of class, by the end of the second or third day of class, I know a little bit about my students. I've gotten to know the room a little bit, and I've said a little bit about myself, which I hope that by the time you're watching this that you are thinking of things that you'd like to share with the class about yourself. I think it's always nice if we know where people come from. So you tell us where you're born or where you grew up. Tell us what your major is if you know that. I think that also it's nice to know what you like to do when you're not at school time. Do you work? Do you have a job? Do you have a family? Do you have favorite thing you like to do? I always like to present this question of, what book do you wish you had written? Followed by, what movie do you wish you had made? So think about that. Maybe you can share that with us as a group. I'll tell you a little bit about myself now at the beginning of the third section, and then we'll talk about the first poems in the Norton Anthology. But just real quick, I am Jesse Graves. Dr. Graves is what students usually call me, how I usually am addressed in emails and such. I do have a PhD in English from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. I have an MFA, which is a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from Cornell University. And I did my undergraduate studies also at UT in Knoxville. I grew up not very far from here in Johnson City. I grew up in Sharps Chapel, Tennessee, which is in Union County. It's about 30 or 40 miles north of Knoxville, but pretty far out in the country. So that's where I lived until I moved to Knoxville to go to college. My parents still live there. My ancestors settled in that community in the 1780s. So I have a long history in East Tennessee. I feel very much at home here at East Tennessee State University. I am an associate professor. I started here in 2009. This year I will become the poet in residence at ETSU, which is a new title. I have published a couple of volumes of my own poetry. The first volume came out in 2011, Tennessee Landscape with Blighted Pine, and the second volume came out last year, 2014, called Basin Ghosts. And these books are available in the bookstore on Amazon if you want to give them if you want to look at them. I also have a website which talks about my poetry, talks a little bit about my teaching as well. You can learn about awards and recognitions that I've gotten and read some of my poems if you would even like to do that. I was always curious about my professors when I was a student. I always wanted to get to know a little bit about their lives, but really I wanted to get to know about their work. I wanted to know what my professors did for work when they weren't in class with me. I knew that I was in class with them only, 3 or so hours a week, so I knew there must be more to this job than that. So if you want to get a sense of what my other work is, what my research is, what some of my service work is, you can look at my website, which is just Jesse Graves. If you search Jesse Graves poetry, you'll come up with it. As I said, I've been here at ETSU since 2009. I have taught Introduction to Poetry every year, sometimes twice a year, in the spring and in the summer. So I have thought a lot about these poems. I care a lot about these poems. If you'd like to know my answers to these questions, I think that the book that I most wish that I'd written is Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is probably my favorite poet. I think he is probably the greatest American poet and probably the greatest American artist, period, of any form. I also love Emily Dickinson, who was a contemporary of Walt Whitman's, although they weren't acquainted. I love Robert Frost. I love much of the earlier English poetry, especially the Romantic poets from the late 17 and early 1800s. John Keats, William Wordsworth. These are poets in my top 10 for sure. I love movies. I watch a lot of movies. I suppose that if I were to made a movie, I'd like to have made Chinatown with Jack Nicholson. If you haven't seen that movie, it's worth taking a look at. Yeah, I love movies. I love music. My college job was in a record store in Knoxville, so I listened to a lot of music. Music was my gateway into poetry, I think. I first began by writing songs, and I was a reader of poems before I was a serious writer of poems. So many of you may also write poems, but certainly you're all, for at least the rest of the summer, serious readers of poems. So I want to get into the Norton Anthology with you, which, as I said, is our primary text, and it's the book that we'll be starting the class with. And I'm on the same handout that I left off from the Adam Zagajewski poem, and I've got some notes on Norton, pages 1 through 8 here, about halfway down the page. And I'll go through some of those. I really love how this book opens. There are a lot of books, anthologies of poetry like this one, and I always come back to using this one because I love the way it's organized. I love the way it's arranged. It doesn't have maybe as many footnotes as I wish that it had, but that's okay. That's a fair trade-off. I want to show you my copy of this book. You can see it's pretty well worn. It's a much-loved copy. I should probably get a new one, but I don't really want to. My notes, many of my notes are in the book. Hope you can see this. I hope that your pages of the book look like this when you're done with this class. I think it's the very best way to take notes. It took me a long time to give myself permission to write in books, because it seemed like I was told not to when I was a kid, and I couldn't quite accept that I could. But it's a great way to keep up with your notes, and it's a great way to keep up with just your thoughts and your impressions. You know, you read a poem once, and you have a set of impressions, and then you read it a fourth time, or in my case, I'm reading some of these poems for the 50th time. And my impressions, I get new ones when I read these. I don't always think the same things. I learn new things about the poems with continued reading. But I like having a record, sort of a track listing of my impressions on these poems. Sometimes they're even in different colored inks because I'm reading them years later. The very opening of this book, I'm on page 1, so we're starting from the beginning, and I think it's a really fine beginning. It says, "If you're a reader of poetry, you already know. Poetry reading is not just an intellectual or bookish activity, it is about feeling. Reading poetry well means responding to it. If you respond on a feeling level, you are likely to read more accurately, with deeper understanding, and with greater pleasure. And conversely, if you read poetry accurately and with attention to detail, you will almost certainly respond to it or learn how to respond to it on an emotional level. Reading poetry involves conscious articulation through language, and reading and responding come to be, for the experienced reader, very nearly one." So, accelerated thinking, amplified feeling. I'm a believer. I'm a believer in this. I think this is true. I'm not going to read the whole book to you, by the way, so relax. I do want you to think about, though, what the message of that opening paragraph is. What are the editors telling us about reading poetry? What are they trying to prepare us for? Do you think they're right? I've already told you that I do. But you know, give some consideration to what they're saying about the experience of reading poetry. I like that they make it a very active thing. It's not a thing you can do passively. I hope you'll read these first pages pretty closely. I like what they tell you about what a course in reading poetry can offer to you. I hope that you're willing to invest more in it than just getting than checking off your oral comprehensive or your genre requirement. I hope you really open yourself up to what poetry can offer to you. I think it's different than any other kind of literature. So there's a section on reading on page 2, and I'd like for you to read those two paragraphs pretty closely and think about the ode and the elegy. Now, these are the two essential modes of poetry, M-O-D-E-S, modes. I think they are the two essential reasons for poetry's being. I think they are the reasons that poetry came into existence in the first place, because ordinary language couldn't fully express, has never been able to fully express the full range of feelings and experiences that we have, especially when it comes to joy, as in the ode. The ode is usually a poem of celebration. It's usually a poem of commemorating an act. The earliest odes were about the Greek Olympic Games, so athletic accomplishment. On the other hand, of grief, which is the elegy, E-L-E-G-Y, the elegy, which is a poem of loss or mourning, a poem of sadness. We experience grief and joy in such magnanimous ways. These are huge experiences in our lives, and it takes a specialized kind of language to fully articulate them. Even that specialized language sometimes falls short. So I'd like to look at a couple poems with you now, particularly the poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning on page 2. It's on your syllabus, of course, called How Do I Love Thee? Now, I suspect that you may have seen this poem or come across some version of it before. If you go to enough weddings in your time, you're probably gonna see somebody read this at a wedding. It is a classic, a capital C classic love poem. It does a lot of what we think of love poetry as doing. I'm going to read it. I want you to just follow along, follow down the page with me. And I want you to think about why. Why this particular poem? The world is full of love poems. There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them, all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Their first lyric poems were also love poems. Sappho, S-A-P-P-H-O, Sappho, a female poet from one of the earliest poets we have any record of, wrote about love and grief and joy and anger and sadness and jealousy. A lot about jealousy. So what those poets wrote about and what poets today write about hasn't changed all that much. I'll read the Browning poem. And as I read it, please think about why this poem is a classic love poem. How Do I Love Thee by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candlelight. I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. I love thee with the passion put to use in my old griefs, and with my childhood's faith. I love thee with a love I seemed to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and, if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. So you see this poem was published in 1850, so this goes back a ways. This is in the Victorian period. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's husband, for whom this poem was written, is Robert Browning, a poet also, whom we're going to be reading from a little bit later on. I think you'll be amused when you see how different their poems are. I think that's pretty great. Opposites did attract in this particular marriage. They have a fascinating love story between them, which I hope you'll Google search, learn a little bit more about. We're not particularly interested in the biographical elements of poets' lives when we read their poems. We're interested in what's on the page. We're interested in the text. not so much the biography. We never ever want to presume that a poem is autobiographical or about a person's own personal life, because poets often make up characters. Poets often make up situations, so that even if it seems similar to the poet's life, we don't want to presume that it is the poet's life. So let's go ahead and think about the speaker. That's what we're going to call the voice that tells us the poem. So we wouldn't say Elizabeth Barrett Browning tells us, we would say the speaker tells us the different ways of counting one's love, right? So that keeps it from being personal and biographical about the poet. This is important because we don't want to presume that all art is just autobiography. Some thoughts about this poem I'd like to consider with you. This, as I said, this is one of the most famous and quoted love poems. The poems on the following pages by Ramsay and Paston are also love poems, presented in a very different way. I think what's most interesting about this poem is that, as you see on page 3 in your book, the editors say this is direct but fairly abstract. So you'll see that most great poetry that we read has a concrete element. It is showing and not telling. It is my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. You know, it is specific to a person, specific to a context, specific to a place. So very concrete poetry. In this Barrett Browning poem, we don't learn really much about the lover or the beloved, except for the sort of abstract way about how they feel about each other, or how the speaker feels about the beloved. You can compare that with the poems on the next 2 pages, particularly the Ramsay poem, which is very concrete, recalling individual episodes that the 2 lovers spent together, talking about the 2 of their lives together. So this poem manages to connect with a lot of readers without being all that specific. Now, this is interesting in the history of poetry. Poems that are more abstract versus poems that are more concrete. Often there's a nice symmetry, there's a nice balance between the 2. So a little bit further down in that paragraph, the editors say what it does not do is say very much about what the relationship between the 2 lovers is like on an everyday basis. So we don't get those kinds of details. So when you're starting to think about what makes the difference between abstract and concrete, that's a good touchstone. That comment is a good place to come back to and think, well, if it doesn't tell us much about the details, then it's not very concrete, right? It's likely to be more abstract, more about ideas or ideals, as she talks about it in the poem. That's a particular kind of poem. That poem takes a particular form. It takes the form of the sonnet, S-O-N-N-E-T. Hope you'll check your glossary for that. And I hope you'll do a little searching about what makes a poem a sonnet, what kind of sonnet this is. There are 2, in English, there are 2 principal kinds of sonnet. One is the Petrarchan or Italian sonnet. The other is the English or the Shakespearean sonnet. Now, I'd like for you to find out which one is this. Which version of the sonnet is this poem, and how do you know? Right? What are the signs that tell you whether a poem is whether a sonnet is an English or an Italian sonnet? So once you think about what the differences are, I think that I think we'll consider some of the other poems in the first few days of class. I'd like for you to think about the poems in pages 1 through 8 as odes. Remember ODE, the poem of celebration? And I'd like for you to think about the poems from pages 8 through 15 as elegies, poems about loss or mourning. So most of these are love poems in the odes, although that's certainly not the only thing you can write an ode about. In the second half, these are poems about death, poems about losing people that we love. So I want you to think about the differences in those. I'm looking at page 9 at the very top of the page, if you would like to follow along. The editors say poems can be about all kinds of experiences, and not all the things we find in them will replicate or even relate to experiences we may have had individually. But sharing through language will often enable us to uncover feelings of love or anger or fear or confidence we did not know we had. So think about this Ben Jonson poem, On My First Son, being an elegy for the loss of a child. And then on page 11, this Seamus Heaney poem. Heaney died only recently, and I think that there was some consensus before he died that he was the greatest living poet in the world. And I have no argument against that. I think he's one of the greatest poets in the English language. So I hope you'll read this poem called Midterm Break, and think about the form of that poem. Think about, for instance, in line 6, how the phrase "a hard blow" has 2 different meanings in the context of the poem. Why was the speaker embarrassed in the 3rd stanza when the old men stood up to shake his hand? These are some questions I want you to consider. And then I want you to think about the effect of that last line, a 4-foot box, a foot for every year, and what that tells us about the speaker and about the situation. So I think we will call that the end of section 3. I hope that you will look on page 15 and consider very closely those suggestions for responding to poems, particularly the first one that says read the syntax literally. Okay, I was kidding. That wasn't really the end of section 3. So let's spend just a couple minutes on page 15. We have these 10 suggestions for responding to poetry. How to be a better, it's almost like a checklist for how to become a better reader of poetry, and I think it's a good list. What the words say literally is only a starting point, but it is the place to start. In class, I sometimes find that students overreach in their interpretations of poems. They are stretching to find some way to resolve the meaning of an ambiguous poem, and they might say, well, maybe it's because the speaker really wanted to kill their lover, and that's why the poem feels this way. And there might be poems about that, but here's the thing. You don't want to insert some wild stretch into a poem if it's not explicitly written out. So we don't want to be like reaching for explanations or solutions that aren't presented literally in the poem. So the second one is articulate for yourself what the title, subject, and situation make you expect. Titles are very important. Nothing is ever random in a poem. Everything in a poem is a choice. Everything in a poem is a deliberate consideration by the poet. So identifying the expectations, the situations, and number 4 there, the traditions. We just talked about the sonnet for the Browning poem. So that's one of the traditions behind that poem. So you want to be able to locate what those are and understand them. Look up anything you don't understand. This is so very important. It takes like 2.5 seconds to look up a word now because we pretty much always have the internet at our fingertips. So don't undercut your reading of a poem by not knowing what a word means. We're going to find a little bit later on in this semester when we get to the Robert Hayden poem. There's a kind of common word that's used in an uncommon way at the end of that poem. And if you don't look the word up, if you don't think enough about what it means, then you're going to miss the whole movement of the poem, the whole meaning of the poem. So be willing to be surprised, I think, is good advice. And assume there's a reason for everything. Poets do make mistakes, but when a poem shows some degree of control, it is safest to assume that everything's carefully chosen. I hope that we will be able to have some discussions about these poems. We may not always agree. We may not always come to the same interpretations. There's a subjective element to reading poetry. That doesn't mean that it means whatever you think it means, right? Because all of these elements sort of lead you toward how to gather the meaning. So it doesn't mean just whatever, but the criticism of poetry has existed for centuries because smart readers, engaged readers, disagree about the interpretation. So we may have some good times with different interpretations of poems throughout this term. This is the true end to section 3, so I'll be back to talk about some poems in section 4 with you.